Welcome. We're here for another episode of Buddhist Yoga and Medicine podcast. We're joined with Dr. Jason Birch. Thank you so much for coming on the show again.
Thank you.
And we're here to discuss your latest publication, which is a translation and critical edition of the Yogacintamani. And so many of the keen yoga students and practitioners who are listening may not be so familiar even with this text. Could you tell us a little bit about it, its author and dating, and its relation to other major Hatha texts?
Yes, that's a good question to start with. So the Yogacintamani is a large compendium on yoga. It's been estimated by one scribe to be about 3,500 shlokas. That's 3,500 verses. By way of comparison, that's that texts that people know, such as the Hatha Pradipika, is roughly around 400 to 500 verses, depending on what recension. So the Yogacintamani is 6 to 7 times the size of the Hatha Pradipika. It's a very large text. It was composed in the 17th century in Varanasi, which is a period when North India was under Mughal rule. And at that time, there was a vibrant intellectual life, if you like, in a lot of the intellectual disciplines, and yoga was no exception. So at that time, we find people like Shivananda Sarasvati, the author of the Yogacintamani, sitting down with an array of texts before them. In his case, a large array of yoga texts, and deciding that they wanted to write compendiums that integrated and synthesized the sort of previous traditions of yoga and the different types of yoga that had been taught in the past. And that was really his agenda. He based his work on an earlier compendium by the same name called the Yogacintamani that was written in the early 16th century, maybe 80 to 100 years before he was working. And that text was a compendium, but mainly on Patanjali yoga. So the author of that text was sort of more interested in the connection between Patanjali's yoga and Vedanta. So sort of took a lot of the sutras, wrote a commentary that, rather than the sort of Sankhyan commentary of the Bhashya that we see in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, he sort of wrote a more Vedantic orientated commentary. Well, Shivananda Sarasvati, 100 years later, he too was from a Vedantic lineage. In fact, though he was a Sarasvati, a Shaiva Dashnami, a Shaiva renunciate, he traced his lineage back to Shankara. So he very much saw himself in that Vedanta lineage. So this earlier compendium that focused on Patanjali, but from a Vedantic point of view, was a great starting point for him, because he could use all of the Patanjali yoga material and then just add material from other types of yoga that he was interested in. And he was particularly interested in Hatha and Raja yoga, the types of yoga that we see taught from the 11th to the 15th century that sort of culminated in the Hatha Pradipika, the light on Hatha composed by Svatmarama. And so he broke up the earlier compendium, sort of reordered the material into a slightly different schema, but nonetheless, there's consistency between the two. So what both compendiums do generally is the first half of the compendium just addresses general questions about yoga. So in the earlier compendium, which is on Patanjali yoga, of course, it starts with the first sutra, but then goes into a long discussion about adhikara, who's qualified to practice yoga. Well, in Shivananda's compendium, the later one, he starts with the question, what is yoga? So there's a really interesting dialogue, which I've translated, and it's in the introduction to the book I've just published. There's a really interesting dialogue about how he answers that question from lots of different perspectives. He takes definitions of yoga from different traditions, from Patanjali's yoga, from earlier Vedantic texts, then from Hatha and Raja yoga texts, and sort of creates a discussion where, one definition sort of through his commentary seamlessly blends into the next definition. So he's trying to iron out any what might be conceived as inconsistencies or any incoherence between these different definitions of yoga, and streamline them into a sort of flowing discussion on the topic. And personally, I think he does quite a good job. He sort of succeeds, particularly with that part of the text on answering what is yoga. Other parts of the text, particularly, as I say, the first half, are quite discursive. It jumps around from different topics. Some of them quite obvious topics that you'd expect in a text on yoga, like where to practice, who should practice, how to start the practice. You should start with easy techniques and then progress. The goal of yoga, all these sort of general questions that you imagine a student would want answered at the beginning. And then the second half of the text is a more structured discussion of Ashtanga yoga, the yoga with 8 auxiliaries, beginning with yama niyama and then ending with samadhi. And that is a great sort of mechanism for him to discuss the practice of yoga, touching on all the components, necessary components for the practice, but then bringing in material from lots of different traditions under that schema. So earlier texts that didn't teach Ashtanga yoga, such as the Hatha Pradipika, you nonetheless have lots of material on asana and pranayama that can be brought into a discussion of Ashtanga yoga, because asana and pranayama are the third and fourth components of that system. So yes, that's the sort of structure of his compendium. It's trying to bring lots of different traditions together under for a Vedantic audience, and it was done on a very ambitious scale, very large text, and wide ranging, in a lot of citations. A lot of citations from different works, Puranas, the epics, the Yoga Vasishta was a text he particularly liked, and then of course lots of different yoga texts.
Dr. Birch, many question if there's a tension, and I guess would be dependent on the text or tradition, a tension between later Hatha formulations and the Yoga Sutras. What does this text tell us about their relationship, or how they can be synthesized?
Yes, excellent question. Of course, the main tension, if you like, or the main difference, if you're trying to bring these different types of yoga together, is a lot of the theory that's in Patanjali yoga. And as we know, a lot of that theory is sort of adapted from the Sankhya system of philosophy, which posits Prakriti and Purusha as sort of two central phenomenon that the yogi has to deal with in order to achieve liberation. And it so happens that really he has to realize that the two are separate, that Prakriti and Purusha being the sort of the inner witness, if you like, or a very basic form of consciousness, and Prakriti being the material world, which is not just everything around us, but of course the body itself and our thoughts and everything that composes the ego. Of course, the theory with later yoga traditions is very different. Prakriti and Purusha, that not only that type of thinking, but even that terminology doesn't really figure in the medieval yoga traditions. It's much more based on uniting the individual self, the Jivatman, with the universal self, Brahman. So they adopt, in that sense, a more Vedantic type of uh, outlook, but also very much inflected by earlier tantric systems of yoga. So the terminology is very different. The goal of liberation is expressed differently. And so what we sort of see with Shivananda in this compendium is basically him drawing equivalences between the two. So he sees Kaivalya as moksha, Kaivalya being the word that Patanjali used for liberation, moksha being the word that Vedanta and Tantric traditions would use. Purusha and Prakriti are still there, but perhaps more in the background, and Purusha is really equated with the Parama Atman, the universal self, rather than a sort of an isolated monad of the individual. I mean, definitely Shivananda would argue that the Purushas, a person's Purushas blend together to as a universal self, rather than each person having their own Purusha or consisting of an inner Purusha. So there are sort of subtle shifts to create the synthesis, but nonetheless, that was his agenda. So he sort of takes the theory and blends it together more from a Vedantic point of view. And when it comes to the practice, I think it's much easier, as I said before, to take elements of different yoga traditions, which are essentially based on practice, abhyasa being a central theme of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, as it's said in Sutra 112, that yoga, the cessation of mental activity, is brought about through vairagya and abhyasa. Well, the abhyasa side is sort of there throughout the centuries with different techniques and practices that yogis have done. So I think that's probably the easier part of his agenda, to sort of bring the practices together under asana, pranayama, meditation, visualization, and so forth. All of that's quite easy to blend together. And yes, with the the Ashtanga format then allows him to discuss other aspects like yama and niyama and the codes of behavior and so forth as well. So so the tensions are there in the theory, and I think once he gets past that in terms of discussing things like liberation, how it's achieved, karma, and those sort of essential subjects. Once he gets past that, then in terms of discussing the practice of yoga and bringing the different techniques together, I think that's where his work is much easier.
This is a question that comes to mind. This is a translation of the asana section, and having had some time working on other chapters, do you find it cohesive in terms of how he harmonizes? If he's a follower of Shankara, perhaps, or Advaitin, how do you harmonize this kind of effortful practice or progressive type of?
Yes.
And then the other, there are different adoptions. For example, a definition of Hatha Yoga is the union of prana and apana. So I'm wondering how you feel he is managing these different threads of theory and practice.
Yeah, very good question. So there has been, before he was active for many centuries, there had been a debate within Advaita Vedanta about the role of yoga. Some teachers considering it to be unnecessary, that liberation depends upon knowledge depends upon listening, reflecting upon and meditating upon the truths of the Upanishads, and you just need a guru and a tradition to sort of support you in that endeavor, and that will bring about liberation. So from that perspective, yoga is not necessary. But others were willing to accept that yoga could play a role, that it could purify the mind, and make that process of listening to the Upanishads, meditating, and on the truths of the Upanishads easier and more effective. So, of course, yoga is mentioned in the Upanishads itself. So a lot of Vedantic commentators could never really get away from it. And Shankara himself has to discuss yoga when writing on the Bhagavad Gita and certain Upanishads, the Katha Upanishad, for example, which mention yoga. So it's always there in the tradition. It's in the fundamental texts. It's just really the debate is more about, the extent to which it's accepted or not. And I think what we see in Shivananda's work is full acceptance of yoga. In fact, not just sort of saying that it can play, a helpful role in purifying the mind, but that in actual fact it's the best way to sort of purify body and mind, and then approach the sort of study of the Upanishads and the realization of its Gnostic truths. I think it's clear from the compendium that he believed yoga to be essential in that regard. But of course, the practice of yoga brings about knowledge. So it's not as though you can dispense with knowledge or dispense with that side of the tradition. It's still yoga's still in service to the Gnostic ideals of Vedanta, but he would just say it's a sort of a necessary path or a necessary auxiliary to achieving that that Gnostic realization. So that's how I think he gets over the dilemma between knowledge and action. In terms of the asana section that I focused on, which has a lot of effortful asanas, and Mayurasana, Kukutasana, poses that really are quite strenuous for any practitioner. Well, once he's accepted yoga to play, a significant role in the path as a path to liberation, well, then he's really open to accepting all sort of practices that have been considered important for various yoga traditions before him, and Hatha yoga was no exception. Of course, Hatha for some ascetics, particularly today, has connotations of being a very difficult practice, an effortful practice that's pretty much describing, in many cases, bodily mortification or extreme asceticism, such as Urdhva Bahu and so forth. But of course, from the tradition of Hatha yoga that derives from the Siddha tradition, from Goraksha and Matsyendra and so forth, it's a much more tantric inflected practice that never positioned itself as a sort of a difficult or practice or a form of bodily mortification. So, and of course, the literature's that's very evident in the literature itself. So I think it's easy for Shivananda to sort of appropriate a lot of that literature without necessarily having to confront an issue of tapas, of asceticism, because it's just not there in the sources that he's dealing with. Apart from maybe the yamas and the niyamas, where again tapas can be interpreted more as the sort of mainstream forms of austerity, fasting, and celibacy, and so forth, rather than extreme forms of bodily mortification. So I don't think that's really an issue for him. He doesn't. Of course, there's always been discussions within yoga traditions about how much effort you need to succeed at the practice, and too much effort is often considered to be unhelpful. And of course, Raja Yoga itself, the goal of the physical practices, is considered to be ultimately an effortless sort of state, the state of samadhi. So so that's, yeah, all of those themes around effort are, I think, are evident in his work, and it never, from a Gnostic point of view, never poses any problem for him.
Not a contradiction. Before moving on to specifically what we could learn about asana, I was wondering if anything came to mind in terms of how he defines yoga. And then there was a notion that hatha yoga is an auxiliary of pranayama. I'm quoting, sampragyata samadhi is an auxiliary or indicative of laya yoga, and and asampragyata samadhi is equated with raja yoga. Is there anything that you could touch upon thematically
Yeah,
there?
so that's something I discuss in the introduction, and it's really part of his attempt to integrate these uh, types of yoga that are being taught during his lifetime: hatha, raja, laya, mantra yoga, and so forth. It's his attempts to sort of synthesize those types of yoga within the Patanjali yoga system. So he sees each of those different yogas as being equivalent to an anga, an auxiliary within Patanjali's Ashtanga system. So he says Hatha yoga is simply pranayama. Laya yoga is samprajnata samadhi, the lower level of samadhi. And Raja yoga, the sort of goal of Laya and Hatha, is asamprajnata samadhi, the um, the sort of highest level of samadhi, samadhi without cognizance of an object in Patanjali yoga. So, which I think is an interesting part of his work, the way that he's bringing these different traditions together, seeing equivalences between them, and sort of categorizing them in that way. Which is, even though my book focuses on his exposition of asana, it's in the introduction that I, try and discuss, those aspects of his broader agenda.
What is the particular significance of the Ujjain Yoga Chintamani, this particular manuscript?
Yes, so that's another thing that my book also focuses on. So Shivananda was uh, active in the late 16th century and wrote his compendium. And then in the mid 17th century, someone came along, I think a yogi who had a particular interest in Svara Shastra. So that's Svara Shastra is the sort of knowledge around prognostication, foreseeing the future through nasal dominance. Our breath naturally moves from the left to the right nostril roughly every 2 hours. And in both Tibet and India, this has been a sort of basis for predicting the future. If you know how your breath is moving at auspicious moments or during particular activities, they believed that they could then foresee the outcome of those activities, whether it would be a positive or negative outcome, or future events, like for instance the time of death. Well, a Svara yogi, so someone who had a slightly different perspective, came along in the 17th century and copied out Shivananda's work, but then added lots of notes in the margin based on, his own knowledge and other texts that he was reading. And so it's a sort of it's a unique document because all of these annotations are haphazardly done. On some margin, on some folios, some pages, there's nothing. And then on other pages where a particular topic caught his interest, there's an enormous amount of annotations. The margins are completely full. And he seems to mention himself in the third person at times, sometimes just as Svara yogi. So iti Svara yogi sort of says, Svara yogi says. This could actually just be a scribe or a disciple reporting perhaps the views of his guru, or it could be the guru himself. It's a little ambiguous that way. And then there are also a couple of other instances where he mentions other yogis who were known for particular teachings. And this occurs in the chapter, in the section on asana. It's heavily annotated. Many additional asanas were added to Shivananda's original work. And the reason that I decided to focus my book on that is that the additional asanas really are not documented in any earlier texts, and even many of much of the later material that we have doesn't have a record of these postures or some of the teachings associated with them. So I thought it was an extraordinary document, particularly for the mid-17th century. When I came across it, when I sort of found it at the library in Ujjain in 2010, I was sort of grappling with the question of the history of asana. At that time, histories were being written about modern yoga. And of course, modern yoga is globalized yoga, if you like, is heavily focused on asana practice, postural practice. And of course, many historians were saying, well, actually, if you look at the textual evidence that we have, many of the yoga texts don't teach asana in any way as it's practiced today. Patanjali only has 3 sutras on asana, and in the commentary, a few are mentioned, but they're mainly seated postures. Hatha Pradipika only teaches 15 asanas. There 7 are non-seated, like Mayurasana and Kukutasana. But hey, today gurus have been teaching hundreds of non-seated asanas. Where did they come from? So there are a lot of questions about the antiquity of many of the postures that we see in the 20th century. So I was really grappling with that because I was reading compendiums, many of them unpublished, and coming across manuscript material that did teach large numbers of complex non-seated asanas, and often taught, had rather sophisticated collections of asanas that were in many respects different from one another. So it's not as though they're all of the texts that I was reading were teaching the same material and just reproducing the same postures, but actually the collections are quite different and often have a different focus. The Yoga Pradipika, for example, a Braj Bhasha text written in the 18th century, really focuses on the healing benefits of the 84 asanas that it teaches. So it will basically explain how each asana is done, and then there's usually a verse describing all the health benefits. And they're not just sort of, in many cases, they're not general expressions of positive expressions that an asana is very healthy for you and will heal diseases and so forth. They often mention specific illnesses, specific problems that an asana will cure, which suggests that it's a much more sophisticated understanding of the healing benefits around postural practice than just rhetoric designed to sort of attract people to the practice of postures by saying, oh, it's very good for you, it'll improve your health. The finding the Ujjain manuscript of the Yogacintamani with the extra asanas in it, and having that manuscript dated to the mid-17th century, I thought was an important piece of the puzzle in writing about the history of postural practice. So at the time, it really helped me, along with a few other sources, to establish that before colonialism, before the British really came in, and then you get this sort of influx of European physical culture, calisthenics and so forth coming into India in the sort of 19th century. Before that time, in yoga traditions, particularly, there was a very sophisticated, in some traditions, a very sophisticated postural practice that had been developed over several centuries in play at that time and documented in some of the sources that we have.
I'm going to ask a couple questions that might benefit myself or others that are interested in the history of asana, basically in this line. You mentioned the Yoga Pradipika and its focus on healing benefits. And some of us have followed your more recent publication, Hatha Abhyas Padati, and some recent articles. So
Hmm.
going through these compendiums of asana, for instance, this particular manuscript had three lists. Was that three lists of asana? Oh, I'm wondering if you could maybe start with what is
Yes, correct.
84 asanas, enumerations of asanas, and characters of
Mm,
compendiums, what they show about the stage of development. Like later may have sequencing. Some of them may be more focused in traditional hatha.
mm.
So, what are the 84 asanas? And then how does the enumeration of this larger pre-modern source play into that and the character of asana, how they're presented?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question. So, in some of the early sources on Hatha and Raja Yoga, we see references to 84 asanas. The Vivekamartanda is a very good example, a 12th century text that says Shiva taught 84 lakh of asanas. That's 8,400,000. Of those, 84 are important. And then of those, in order to do Hatha Yoga, you really just need Siddhasana and Padmasana in that particular case. So there's an awareness of 84. Well, there's an awareness of countless number of asanas. And I suppose we're dealing with a culture where sitting on the floor, as well as postural practice within perhaps martial arts, wrestling, and so forth, various aspects of the culture were all alive and active at that time. And someone had said, yes, there's countless numbers of postures. And then perhaps there was a tradition of asceticism that championed the idea of 84 important postures. But it seems in the early phases of its development, Hatha and Raja Yoga were saying that really the innumerable asanas out there that exist are not important, and you really only need two good seated poses, Siddhasana and Padmasana. And that's because the practice of Hatha Yoga at that time consisted mainly of the mudras, and then it sort of went more into the direction of pranayama. So postural practice didn't really become a component of Hatha Yoga until the Hatha Pradipika was written in the 15th century, where Svatmarama, who was sort of reorganizing a lot of the teachings of earlier traditions, came up with this sort of fourfold system that had asana as the first anga, then pranayama, mudra, and Raja Yoga as the fourth component. Um, so from that point onwards, it seems that that opened the door for asana, and Svatmarama himself started to teach non-seated postures. In my view, perhaps because of their healing benefits. If you look at the Hatha Pradipika, it's poses such as Matsyendrasana and Mayurasana that then have verses dedicated to them describing the health benefits. So even though the focus is still very much on pranayama and mudra, um, it seems that non-seated poses were perhaps also practiced for their healing benefits. Funnily enough, I think it's perhaps more in the Tibetan tradition where you get texts on postural practice that talk a lot about how the postures influence prana and apana, the bodily winds, and so forth, and how that can then help your meditation practice feed directly into samadhi through movement and non-seated postures. That definitely, we see that documented probably in the 17th and the 18th century in India, but not so much the earlier traditions of Hatha and Raja Yoga. The emphasis is more on pranayama and mudra. Um, so it's after the Hatha Pradipika that we start to see texts being written that tell us more about a collection of 84 asanas, either give us a list of names, such as the Hatha Ratnavali in the 17th century. The Ujjain manuscript is also another good example where we get a table that has 84 names of postures in alphabetical order. And then we start to get descriptions of the asanas that are in these collections of 84. And the Ujjain manuscript has descriptions of 55 asanas. And other texts, such as the Yoga Pradipika that I mentioned, have descriptions of 84. The Hathabhyasa Padhati has 112. So the number of 84 as a collection certainly had currency, and and shaped the teachings of asana in some traditions. But then it seems that other traditions just kept adding more and more asanas to their repertoire, and so it goes beyond 84 to 96, 112, and so forth. And then, of course, with the Ujjain manuscript, the final list of asanas has over 100 names in it. So probably what was happening there is that people are getting different 2 or 3 collections of 84 asanas and then bringing them together. And of course, each collection having unique postures within it. So when you combine them, you start to get more than 84 asanas.
I was wondering if I
Um,
could, please. Yes, yes.
yeah, no. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I thought to move towards some questions I'm sure you'll be answering uh, as more read this publication, specifically about asana. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what these particular asana can tell us about the author and also about this running discourse on the postural practice. So there's 3 that involve a prop or a belt or a familiar term. So Paryanka,
mhm.
Sopashraya, and Yoga Patasana. I was wondering if you could tell us about what those are, how they employ props, and then some of these are among, I believe it's 12 that are listed in the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, uh, like Paryanka.
Yes.
Right. So a little bit about what these asana are.
Yeah, so these asanas are very old. They go back to Patanjali Yoga in the 5th century, and there's possibly references in the Mahabharata. I can't be sure off the top of my head, but it's basically sitting in either a cross-legged position or perhaps a sort of more of a squatting position where the knees are higher. With the legs could still be crossed, but the knees are high, or the legs could be straight like that. And a belt is wrapped around the shins and then around the lower back, and that enables the yogi to sort of sit upright, still without moving for long periods of time. So it's a seated posture, I'd say, developed for meditation, undoubtedly. Um, and also, of course, we get uh, pictures, iconography depicting yogis sitting with straps and belts around their legs and lower back. So I think it's over the centuries was a fairly prevalent form of sitting for meditation, and we see descriptions of it in the Ujjain Yogacintamani manuscript. I think the unique description in the Ujjain manuscript is the use of the T-shaped prop, which is again very old in terms of ascetics, using uh, either a danda type of rod type of um, instrument, if you like, to help them sit upright, or even using the rod, of course, as an emblem in itself. But in the Ujjain Yoga Chintamani, it's undoubtedly used for the posture. In one description, it's used for sitting, where the yogi places his arms over the T part of the prop to stay upright. And then in another description, the yogi has the legs in lotus, then sort of lifts the hips up, so he's balancing on just the knees, and then places the T-shaped prop against the abdomen to remain upright. It's a sort of, I suppose it would be a bit like a balance. I've often thought it would be a great posture to sort of demonstrate. I mean, I'll have to try and make the T-shaped position, but it would be a good one to sort of demonstrate. In the Ujjain manuscript, it's said to prevent sleep, nidrahara. It's sort of nidrahara asana. It's the pose for preventing sleep. So it's obviously a bit of a balance. You're in lotus on the knees, being propped up, and of course, if you started to nod off, you would probably fall over pretty quickly. So, and that would wake you up. Um,
And there was
and
also
that,
mentioned
yes,
for that, for Nidrahara, the
yeah,
lift.
That's right. Putting licorice and pepper, sort of snuff in the nose. That I'm sure that would also keep a person awake quite effectively. But that practice in an Indian yoga text I haven't seen documented elsewhere. So that's quite special.
Number 43, Sama Samstana. There's a note that you made that there was mention of Vachaspati Mishra's Tattva Vaisharadi, but also
Mm,
an article by Mas. So the question is, now that they're listing some of these asana that are there in the Yoga Sutra commentary, how
mm.
is it are they being presented and taught similarly, explained similarly, or what are the sources for how they are being taught in this updated manual?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question because part of the Yoga Chintamani's agenda, as I mentioned earlier, was to bring Patanjali Yoga together with Hatha Yoga, and that's what I think we're seeing in the asana section. Some of the asanas from Patanjali. I mean, of course, many of them are already there, such as Padmasana. That's ubiquitous among yoga traditions. So you generally pick up a text and you'll see it regardless of the tradition. You'll see Padmasana in the medieval period. Siddhasana becomes a very sort of commonly practiced pose. But some of the poses, the lesser known poses, particularly the animal poses in Patanjali's list, which are not even called asanas, but sitting positions, um, uh, nishadanas. They're brought into this particular list of asanas in the Yoga Chintamani, and they're following Vachaspati Mishra's descriptions. And Vachaspati Mishra, I'm not sure that I mean, he was very much a scholar. I'm not sure how much of a practitioner he was, and some of the descriptions are very rudimentary. For instance, camel pose, ush, ushtra, nishada, or ushtrasana. He just says is sitting like a camel. It's not particularly the description is not particularly helpful. I think in one case in the Ujjain Yoga Chintamani, there's a more elaborate description of one of those animal poses from that's mentioned in Patanjali's Yoga Shastra. So so um, so that's an exception. Otherwise, I think they generally follow what Vachaspati Mishra said in his commentary on the Yoga Shastra.
Uh, Verse 15, or asana 15, actually is Virasana, hero pose. And there's a
Mm,
reference to Kadi Mata Tantra or Godrian's Tantra Raja Tantra. So are there
mm.
tantric compendiums they're drawing from? Or is the
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, so that reference I think is an additional scribal comment um, to a tantra, but even in the original work of Shivananda, he draws on tantric sources. The Parameshvara, the Matanga Parameshvara Tantra is one example. Um, I think at least 3 or 4 asanas are taken from the Matanga. The Dharmaputrika, which is not so much a tantra, but it's within that Shiva Dharma corpus, so very much an old Shaiva tradition, is the source of four asanas in the Yoga Chintamani. Um, so yes, he's elsewhere throughout the text. There are passages from the um, from other tantras that and also tantric compendiums. The Triparasara Samuchaya, for example, is a tantric compendium that has extensive teachings on nada and the chakras that Shivananda quotes. So he was definitely drawing on tantric material.
This question is bring up that topic, intertextuality, and I want to make for listeners it not to be too difficult to understand. but it's something I learned a lot from reading specifically this translation. I'm wondering, one, just briefly, if you could mention a little bit more about this Dharma Putrika, one. And two, there was another text, I think it's just easily translated as Ocean of Life, and it was a Persian text, Bar al Hayat, I believe.
Ah, yes, yep. Bahr al-Hayat.
If you could speak a little bit about either of these texts and how they interface.
Yeah, so the Dharmaputrika is a text that French scholar Christelle Barrois has done a lot of work on and published an article on it for the Journal of Yoga Studies a few years ago. And it's a text that could date to as early as the 7th or 8th century. Um, and it teaches a very elaborate system of yoga for such an early period of time. Um, I think it teaches 4 or 6 asanas, maybe 6. Um, and those asanas are quoted by Shivananda in his Yogacintamani. The reason that that's quite special is because even though the Dharmaputrika was undoubtedly an important text within the Shaiva tradition that created it and many Tantric Shaiva traditions that followed, it sort of drops off the radar with medieval yoga traditions, and it's really not quoted or cited in any yoga text um, until the Yoga Chintamani of the late 16th century. There's definitely some of the ideas in the yoga of the Dharmaputrika are there in other medieval yoga texts, such as the Hatha Pradipika, for example. There's a few verses that are clearly modeled on verses from that text. If not the text itself, then perhaps some intermediary source between the Dharmaputrika and the Hatha Pradipika. So I think for the history of yoga, it's an immensely important work, and we're sort of seeing it resurface in this compendium in the 16th century as a source for some of the asana teachings. Um, the second part of your question, the Bahr al-Hayat, well, that raises a sort of another aspect of the collection that's unique to the Ujjain manuscript. So some of the asanas that are added to that collection are attributed to a person, to a yogi called Mohandas, who is said to have taught several of the complex asanas, um, in the collection. And it just so happens that the 5 or 6 asanas that are attributed to him uh, have the same names and are sort of identical in form to some asanas that are recorded and illustrated in a Persian compendium that was, in terms of the illustrated compendium, created in the early 17th century. The text itself is said to go back to the mid 16th century. So that's definitely predating, or just a little bit earlier than the Yogacintamani itself, and definitely earlier than the Ujjain manuscript. Um, so the reason that this is very important is because when you read the descriptions of these asanas in the Persian text, the Persian language, it's very clear that they're talking about the same postures that are in the Sanskrit Ujjain Yogacintamani manuscript. In fact, it's sort of clear, it sort of suggests that they perhaps had a common source. I mean, both of these are compilations, they're not original texts. So they were probably borrowing either from an earlier work, the same work, or perhaps they had the same source, they were from the same tradition. And that raises the question, of course, of who is Mohandas. And I wasn't really able to answer that question until I came across another text in Hindi from the Ujjain library, same Ujjain library that had this extended version of the Yogacintamani, that is not outwardly a work on yoga. It's a work on Svara Shastra. It's a work on this sort of system of prognostication, which is connected in some circles more to astronomy than to yoga. But as I'm now coming to understand, there was definitely a tradition of Svara Shastra that was heavily invested in yoga and very sophisticated systems of yoga practice. And it's in this Hindi work, the same asanas are taught and that are in the Ujjain Yogacintamani attributed to Mohandas, and that are in the Persian work, the Bahr al-Hayat. In fact, the Bahr al-Hayat has a collection of 22 asanas, and all 22 are taught in this Hindi text, and they're pretty much in the same order. And again, when you read the Hindi and the Persian side by side, it's clear that they're the same postures and that they're derived from a common source. And the author of this Hindi work, Alak Das, cites his guru as being Mohandas. So, so that sort of suddenly, sort of sent off what would you say, fireworks in my head, that we were definitely dealing with the same person here, and that this person was obviously known for teaching a collection of asanas that was, at least in the 16th century, so well known and prominent that it prompted a Persian author to put it into his compendium on yoga and Svara Shastra. So since then, I've come to sort of propose that this figure of Mohandas could well have been a famous disciple of Dadu, the founder of the Dadu Panth, who was very active in Rajasthan around the 16th century. Dadu had numerous devotees, but one in particular, Mohan of Mehwa, was supposed to be particularly famous and could well be the Mohan that was teaching these asanas within a tradition of Svara Shastra. And it's really the connection with Svara Shastra that makes me think that this Mohan of the disciple of Dadu is in fact the Mohan being mentioned in regard to these asanas, because he was said to be a master of Hatha Yoga and a master of Svara Shastra in some of the hagiographical material of the Dadu tradition. So that's these sort of Hindi, Persian, Sanskrit parallels became an exciting part of the research. We're seeing postural practice move, from a yoga tradition, probably connected to the Dadu Panth, the Sant tradition, being employed or being practiced as part of their knowledge of Svara Shastra, and we're seeing it move into a sort of Persian Sufi tradition, where it's not just a sort of an academic or scholarly interest. You can sort of see when you read the Bahr al-Hayat Persian text that they're also modifying some of the benefits, some of the theory around the practice to suit the sort of Persian outlook, the Sufi outlook at the time. So that suggests to me a genuine interest, not only in documenting the postures, but also perhaps in practicing them in Sufi circles. So yes, that's something, that's a sort of connection that I was able to make through the Ujjain manuscript that then led me to the Hindi manuscript. And of course, the Bahr al-Hayat is a text that's been worked on by other scholars, Persianists such as Karl Ernst, has written many articles and has now done a translation of the Bahr al-Hayat. He did a translation of the chapter on asanas for an exhibition that was in 2015, done by Deborah Diamond at the Smithsonian Institute on Yoga, big exhibition that traveled around parts of America, produced a wonderful catalogue. So yes, the Bahr al-Hayat has been on my radar for many years, and to find this sort of connection with Indian yoga traditions, which I'm able to sort of talk about in the book at length now, as that was a big breakthrough for me.
Really fascinating area. Hope we will hear more in coming years. There are a couple distinctive passages. I was wondering if you would share a little bit. Sundardev in, I guess it's Hatha Tattva Kamodi, he
Mhm.
mentions that Danyarasana, bow pose. So I think for the reader of of some of these text practitioners might find this interesting, where he says that this causes purification of the nadis. So bow pose.
Mm.
Um, anything that you would say about that, or a similar indication for Kukutasana, the wild?
Yes. So 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 Sundaradeva's Hatha Tattva Kaumudi has been published with a translation, but it actually doesn't have that much on asana in it. It's actually his other work, the unpublished work, the Hatha Sanketa Chandrika, which has a larger section on asana with more of his own commentary. And Sundaradeva is quite a fascinating figure in the sort of literature of yoga because he was a Vaidya, he was a Ayurvedic physician, um, living in Varanasi, probably in the 17th century, perhaps the first half of the 17th century. And he wrote um, a compendium, two compendiums that are similar to the Yogacintamani in terms of their scale. But of course, with the asana section, the fascinating thing there with his discussion of asana is he really focuses on the healing benefits of the postures. He sort of adds a lot of his commentary is about the diseases and various benefits that the postures have. And in discussing Kukutasana and Danyarasana, the comment that he adds is that those two asanas purify the nadis. They're for nadi shuddhi. So, and that's a comment that I haven't found elsewhere. Although, funnily enough, I do now starting to see it in some annotations. Um, it was in among the annotations of the Ujjain Yoga Chintamani, so it's in the book that I've published, but also just some other manuscripts of the Hatha Pradipika, for example. I think there's at least one next to Danyarasana says that it's Nadi Shuddhyarta for the purpose of purifying the nadis or something like that. Um, so yes, again an interesting idea that's there in the literature about those two poses.
Number 24, Matsyendra Pitta. There's a
Mhm.
mention of Kundalini. Is that just taken from Hatha Pradipika, or similar texts?
Yes.
There much discussion of Kundalini in this text? Perhaps.
Um, I think yes, I think it crops up, but really, again, it's specific to certain techniques, which actually um, because the Yoga Chintamani borrows heavily from texts such as the Hatha Pradipika, where raising Kundalini is a sort of central theme. Then verses from that text, particularly on meditation and the mudras that discuss Kundalini, are quoted in the Yoga Chintamani. Um, yes, so that's in the extra verse on Matsyendrasana in the Hatha Pradipika that it awakens Kundalini. And so generally when you find a description of Matsyendrasana in later texts, such as the Yoga Chintamani, that's mentioned among the benefits.
Number 25, Paschimottanasana. You mentioned
Mhm.
Hasima Marga, and also the relationship to Shushumna. Do you think can you elaborate a little bit on that for readers?
Yes, again, that's from the Hatha Pradipika, I think makes that quite clear that's about moving prana into the Paschima Marga, the back channel, um, and it's um, fairly clear, I think, from the verse itself that it's talking about Sushumna, though the word Sushumna is not used. But then, of course, when you look at commentators' remarks on that verse, such as Brahmananda in his Jyotsna on the Hatha Pradipika, it's explicitly stated that Paschima Marga is the Sushumna Marga, the central channel. So it seems that the one of the aims of practicing Paschima um, Tanasana, Paschimottanasana Tanasana being the posture, was to move prana into the central channel, which is, of course, a way of saying the yogi achieves samadhi. Usually, the practice of pranayama and the attainment of samadhi is moving the breath from Ida and Pingala, which nadis, which run either side of Sushumna, moving the breath out of those and into the central channel. And that, of course, enables the yogi to enter into a profound state of meditation, remaining completely still as though not breathing at all, but nonetheless remaining alive because the breath is moving in the central channel. So, so this was one way of explaining the attainment of samadhi as moving the breath into the central channel.
For number 19, which is Mayurasana, you mentioned that the redactor of the Ujjain Yogacintamani drew from Vasishta, the Hatha, and there's a comment about how to translate the breath will flow in the moon channel. So this is for peacock pose. And I was wondering if when one of these compilers redacts from different texts, are there scribal errors that you see a lot that have to be figured out with translation during translation?
Absolutely, particularly with the Ujjain Yogacintamani, because a lot of the notes are in the margin. They're very faint. They're sort of scribbled in many respects, like we might jot down some notes in a lecture, or if you're attending the teachings, you're sort of making the notes for yourself so that you can refer to them at a later time. And so you're not expecting them to be read generally. You're not writing them very carefully and thinking um, about the expression and the words that you're using. You're just sort of writing them for yourself. And I think that's very much how the annotations of the Yoga Chintamani were made. So that means that in some places the notes are very rough, and in the syntax, the grammar doesn't necessarily make sense because they're just jottings. They're just sort of um, loose notes. In other cases, they're copying from another text, such as Sundaradeva's Hatha Sanketa Chandrika. It's clear that the scribe was copying some verses, perhaps had memorized the verse and sort of said, "Oh, that's relevant here. It's not in the Yoga Chintamani," and wrote it in the margin. Nonetheless, that can still be difficult to read because the writing's so small. The writing's not as clear and as large as the writing in the center of the manuscript. The writing in the margins is fainter and much smaller. So that was certainly a challenge in editing this material, trying to read the notes and also trying to work out some of the notes that were um, just written in partial sentences, not complete sentences, and yeah, and so we're not easy to translate or understand.
And coming full circle for this last question, to conclude this question about the character or nature of this compendium, if some of the readers study the Hatha Abhyas Padhati and some of your more recent articles in the Journal of Yoga Studies, when they look at a text like this now, um, I think many would have an interest in questions about sequencing or how these were practiced. So when any comparisons you could make in terms of these different compendiums of what they're sharing with us.
Yes, in the case of the Yoga Chintamani and the Ujjain manuscript, I think there was no intention to record sequences of the asanas. It's really just a compilation drawing, in the case of the original work, drawing from different texts, citing the name of the text and the description of the asana. And with the notes in the Ujjain Yoga Chintamani, they're just sort of scribed in the margin, as I say, or between the lines of the original text, and sort of done quite haphazardly. So I don't think there was any order in the way the text was compiled or put together. The Hatha Padati is quite different in that regard. I think that um, it's definitely the case that many of the asanas were written down as they were practiced in a sequence. And that's partly indicated by the fact that the asanas are grouped into various into 6 basic groups. And that the way the asanas are written, it seems that one posture is the sort of necessary starting point for the next posture. That's not always the case, but it sort of suggests that that there was a practical component in mind of the person writing down the descriptions. And the descriptions are so terse that often you can't really understand the shape of the pose without knowing the pose that went before it. And that was a big breakthrough I think, in our research on the Hatha Padati, because many of the asanas were already known from a work called the Sri Tapanidhi, but the poses were taken out of order and jumbled up. And so you didn't get that sort of clear sequential nature of the descriptions in the Sri Tapanidhi. So I think even though we don't have a text explicitly discussing sequencing of asanas, like which ones to do first, in the middle, and then at the end, I think it's probably just an aspect of the practice that was never documented, perhaps because gurus had a wide-ranging ideas about that. There was no particularly sort of fixed sequence that across traditions that people wanted to adopt. And so what you see in texts is generally they remain silent on particular aspects of the practice where there's many divergent opinions, and leave that perhaps up to the guru to decide. I think it's quite ridiculous to think that asanas in pre-modern India weren't practiced in some sort of sequence. I think it's a sort of practical necessity in many respects. You don't just sort of sit down to practice asanas for a period of time without having some idea of what to start with and what to finish with. It's just that we don't have a lot of we don't have a lot of textual material to suggest that it was formalized. A sort of formal teaching existed from that period, other than the Hatha Padati. I also feel that the Yoga Pradipika there may be some practical sequencing in the asanas of the Yoga Pradipika, simply because there's another text that has the same group of asanas that was not borrowing from the Yoga Pradipika, but we see those asanas being taught, some of the asanas being taught in the same sort of sequence. That could mean that they're going back to an older source that had the postures, but it could also be seeing that they describe the asanas with different language. It's not like there's similarities in the descriptions themselves. It's not like they're copying from an older text. And so, as we see with the Bahrul Hayat, the Hindi text and the Ujjain Yogacintamani, there are sort of similarities in the way the texts are being described. Well, there's actually 2 texts, the Yoga Pradipika and the Yogasana Mala, that are describing the same collection of postures, but describing them quite differently in different ways. But nonetheless, there's a lot of the postures are still in the same sequence. So that suggests to me that there may have been some idea in practice about how the postures were done, that we sort of see in the text, but without any explanation for it. It's just something that can be inferred, perhaps. But that's very speculative. I think it's the case for sequencing of postures is much clearer in the Hatha Padati.
Dr. Birch, what projects are on the horizon? The rest of this manuscript is being translated, and anything with the Hatha Sanket Chandrika?
Yes, so I'm working with Dr. Shaman Hatley and Professor James Mallinson to finish the Yogacintamani. We're translating, editing, and translating the original work, and we're about we're about a third of the way through, I would say, that text. So another year or two should see us publish at least one volume, and I hope have a sort of draft of the whole text. And then I hope very soon to publish my book, or along with written with Mark Singleton and James Mallinson on the Hatha Abhyasa. That's research that's been in the pipeline for over 10 years now, since before the beginning of the Hatha Yoga project. And we're really just putting the finishing touches on that book, and hope to send it to the printer next month. So it should be out at the end of the year or maybe early next year. Of course, I've got a book on the Yoga Bija, a text that I've been working on for many years, and I think some fascinating work in the way it tries to sort of defend yoga against Gnostic attacks, Gnostic criticism for basically trying to make the case that yoga is not necessary for liberation because all you need is knowledge. Going back to our earlier discussion about Shivananda and Advaita Vedanta, well, the Yoga Bija is an early example of a yoga tradition trying to defend itself from that critique, and making, well, what I feel is quite an interesting and robust argument for the need to practice yoga, as well as containing information on the practice of yoga itself and a few ideas around different types of yogi. It has a really interesting sort of story to explain why some people can just sit down, practice yoga for a short period of time and master it, and being liberated after a short period of time, whereas others have to spend a whole lifetime practicing, and it's only at the end of their life that they're liberated. Well, of course, the explanation for that goes back to past lives, and some people practicing um, for many past lives, but not quite making it, and so being reborn, and then they only have to practice for a short period of time, and suddenly they're perfected it. And that's the sort of life I think that's likened to the way of the crow, and then it's the way of the monkey, that where you sort of sit down perhaps without having done much yoga in the past lives, and so you got to practice for a whole lifetime in order to reach, to make progress and reach liberation. So, very interesting work. I hope to publish a translation and edition and of a very early recension of the Yoga Bija. I hope to do that next year. Uh, and yes, there's other books such as the Hatha Sankirta Chandrika. I know there's an Indian group of scholars working on an edition of that, but I think that text could warrant uh, you know, a broader sort of book discussing not just the Hatha Sankirta Chandrika, but all of the compendiums that I've become aware of written in that period of time from the 16th through to the 18th century, that are trying to sort of discuss yoga on an ambitious scale within the philosophical and religious environments of that early modern period. I think a book looking at their strategies, how they bring different traditions together, how they, as you were asking before, how they resolve some of the contradictions between different religious and philosophical outlooks. All of that would be could make for an interesting book on the history of yoga.
I want to thank you so much again for sharing, and we really look forward to further publications and hearing more about your work. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Thanks for the invitation to an interview. And there should be another book to discuss on the Hatha Abhyasa Padhati early next year.
Wonderful. I'm sure you'll be receiving email requests from me. Hope you'll be.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.